Hello guys, welcome to our third video, and for this specific lecture we will talk about Introduction to Culture and Society. So there were a lot of topics and contexts that Nicole from Crash Course wasn't able to cover in the videos that I assigned to you for this module. So this will cover a lot of topics compared to the other videos, the supplemental videos that I made, so brace yourselves. So first, as it has already been explained in the previous videos, we have already defined culture, and it is the complex whole which includes the knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So this is basically a common way of living that a certain member in a specific geographical location share. And basically this culture guides the way we live our lives. It's a social fact, as Emile Durkheim would put it. And also, we were able to learn about the two aspects of culture in a given society, and these are material culture and non-material culture. So basically, material culture are what people create, from artifacts to features, are products of human cultural activities that are found in a given society who share a common culture. So usually, materials in a given culture are identifiers that say that this thing comes from a specific culture, or this thing or this object represents a specific cultural group. While non-material culture talks about the intangibles and the abstract things found in a culture, like values, beliefs, ideals, and norms. So this consists of the attitudes, beliefs, and ideas that we have as a society who has a shared culture. So an example of a material culture that basically represents the Filipino culture would probably, let's say, the Philippine flag, no, the abanico, abaka, and the different foods that we have in the Philippines are all material cultures. And non-material culture probably would be nationalism, family orientation, those kinds of values, and our value for life. So these are distinct non-material cultural components of our country. But later on, we will learn that there are more specific forms or components of non-material culture. Now, these components of culture, material and non-material, are linked, and physical objects in a culture symbolize cultural ideas. Now, for example, pag nakita natin yung Philippine flag, alam natin that this is connected to the ideals of the Filipino nation of freedom and solidarity and peace. So this material culture of the Philippine flag is connected with certain ideals. But of course, that's a very, very on-the-nose example. We'll give more specific examples on the integration or the link between material culture and non-material culture in a society. You always have to remember that the objects that we use in a certain cultural group reflect how that certain cultural group thinks or feels or collectively behaves. So these are examples of aspects in a culture that could be considered as material culture. For example, infrastructure. So the type of engineering and the type of architecture that is found in a given society, like for example, the religious temples, just one look, you already see that this specific temple or this specific building is a church, a Catholic church. This specific building, it's owned by the Iglesia ni Cristo. This specific building is a Buddhist temple, because there are certain intricacies and differences in relation to the types of design and architecture inside and outside those buildings, and the intricacies in the designs that are found. Like for example, the cross and the mosaic of the saints and other heavenly bodies of the church mean something. And also, like for example, in this specific Hindu temple, some of the statues that are found in the facade of the temple represent some of the gods that are being worshipped in that specific religion. So infrastructure, engineering, architecture are forms of material culture. Aside from religious buildings, there are also structures or infrastructures that are found in the Philippines only that represents our cultural heritage. Like for example, in Batanes, they have the stone houses. right? And then in the rural poor community and the agricultural communities in the Philippines, you have the nipa huts. In somewhere in the south in Zamboanga, we have the vintas, no? So these are basically water floating residences among the southern indigenous peoples. Yon. And of course, the accessories that a certain culture makes use of and represents them. No, again, these are both have practical uses, and of course, at the same time, these serve as a form of cultural identity in for that given social group. And of course, the tools and weapons, like for example, the boomerangs. No, the boomerangs are cultural identifiers of Aboriginal peoples in Australia. Right? For example, the Philippines, we make use of other tools like bolo and itak. So these are a little bit more modern, but in our ancient prehistoric tools that are created by the Filipinos, some of the indigenous groups in the Philippines were the yo-yo. The yo-yo originally is a Filipino product. It's a Filipino tool that is used for conflicts during the prehistoric period. Another form of material culture is the type of clothing that we wear. And of course, if you come from the Philippines, saan tayo dito? This one. So, the Philippines have a specific like traditional form of wear, and you can identify Husi and the Balintawak style dresses. These are definitely Filipino style dresses, and we can also see in that specific type of clothing and costume, we can already see the other cultural influences that we have gone through towards history. Like for example, specifically for for this specific traditional costume, this has been highly inspired by the Spaniards during the time that we were colonized for 333 years. And of course, we have other countries here within the ASEAN states. Of course, I cannot like pinpoint them one by one, but basically each item or each color or the type of fabric or the type of cut or the fashion that this holds have a cultural significance. Hindi lang siya nilagay kasi aesthetics. So yeah, of course, aesthetics, no, half of it, but like half of it also has a cultural significance. Like for example, in the Philippines, our traditional costumes, especially in the Tagalog region, really showed some sort of modesty. No? Modesty yung tinitignan. Kailangan covered, no? So that's one of the cultural ideals that are being propelled during this time that this traditional clothing were introduced. And of course, no, food is also a material culture. Yan, because again, the food is also something that represents a culture because it kind of tells you as well parang what are the food, root crops, animals that are available in a given society. Like for example, you don't expect much rice in the European states, in the Americas, because the land wasn't really tilled for growing rice farms. Unlike when you talk about like most ASEAN states like in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, because of the commonality in terms of the type of agricultural products that we were creating, you can see also similarities. Like almost all of the countries that I've mentioned have rice, no? And so food is also a cultural product or a material culture that represents a certain community or country or cultural group. So to further explain the intricacies and the links between material and non-material culture, here are some extra examples. For instance, weddings, no? In weddings, there are a lot of cultural artifacts found in the whole of the ceremony. For instance, one important cultural artifact in Catholic religious doctrine is the ring, right? That the husband and the wife exchange, no, while they provide their vows to each other till death do us part, etc., etc. And the material culture there is the ring, and the idea, the cultural idea that is bound or linked together with that cultural artifact of the ring is the promise of forever, the promise of family, and the promise of loyalty between the spouses and the religion and the God that basically officiated that union. No? Next example is the jeepney, the Philippine jeepney. And this is the reason why we're quite emotional about the PUV modernization program and the phasing out of the old jeepneys, because not only are we talking about the employment of the jeepney drivers, but we're also talking about the significant loss in the cultural imprint in the Philippines, because we know that in industrializing Philippines, the jeepney has been a very specific cultural identity that is different from other countries within the Southeast Asia and even across the world, no? So the material culture is the jeepney itself and the design that the jeepney takes that is different from other states and countries. And of course, the non-material culture that we're talking about here is the industrializing culture of the Philippines in the 1900s, no? Starting in the 1940s, where this was introduced. The symbolic way that the Filipino is trying to catch up with its neighbors in terms of developing and industrializing. Next, we have in the Muslim culture the hijab, right? So hijab is a very obvious material culture connected with Islam, and we know that when a certain person is wearing a burqa, yung mas covered, or a hijab like this, we can already identify that person. It's a cultural identifier or a religious identifier that this person is subscribing to the religious organization of Islam. And there are a lot of meanings attached to this, but basically it talks about the ideals of a woman who is modest and submissive in the studies and the readings of Islam. No, so the hijab is the material culture, and the modesty and submissiveness of the woman is the cultural idea that is carried by that hijab. Of course, these values that is attached to these materials change over time, but that's the traditional meaning of that. Of course, I could be wrong in terms because there might be new additions to the doctrines or to the teachings, but traditionally that is how it was understood. And of course, I was telling you about the vintas. No, these are cultural identifiers of Zamboangueños who were living, who had their residence in the waters, because they were also living as fishermen during the time, as fisher folks. So the material culture is the vinta, the colorfulness of the vinta, and of course the cultural idea or the non-material culture that is attached to it is the job or the livelihood of fisher folks, and the community's attuneness to the bodies of water that they were interacting with across their lives. And also, when we think about culture, we just don't think about indigenous cultures, no, or regional groups. We also think about like the current pop culture. We also talk about the current modernized culture. And one of the cultural materials that is very, very much relevant in this modern culture that we have are smartphones. And smartphones represent so many things in our modern fast-paced culture in the urban centers of many, many countries, those that are developed centers in many countries. And of course, cell phones represent so many cultural ideas like access to information, liberal ideas, ability to become free, to be able to access all these resources. So yeah, and efficiency. Efficiency is a value that is very much propagated in modernized cultures found in urban centers. And the cell phone and the allowing of cell phone to be used in a given culture says something about the adherence to that specific value. And of course, books. No, books are also cultural materials, no, cultural identifiers in a given society, and the extent to which certain books are allowed in a certain country tells us about the cultural ideas that certain country is allowing among their citizens. Like for example, in Hong Kong, they're already burning down some of the liberal books. So the disallowance of these cultural markers of books that represent liberal ideas are being burned down, and therefore their ideas are not being allowed in that society anymore, no? Or being discouraged. So ayon. And then further, non-material culture could be further categorized into two components. We have the cognitive process and the normative process. So the cognitive process basically talks about all the components of the culture that is related to things that happens internally for every individual that is shaped by social facts found in that culture. So the way we think about things, the way we feel about certain things and certain experiences, those are your cognitive process, no? The way the culture is able to influence your judgment, influence your thinking, influence your learning, and basically helps you interpret the world around you. That is cognitive process. When we talk about normative process of non-material culture, we talk about the more observable behaviors and observable actions that represents how culture influences us, no, as people who are members of a given cultural group. So, for example, in the act of weddings, no, the idea that the ring is a symbol of loyalty and adherence to the sanction of the religion of the marriage of the two individuals. The normative process is the first person who gives the ring is the husband to the wife, and then the wife to the husband, and the whole ceremony, the things that they need to say to each other, the veil, no, the putting of the veil, the lighting of the candle. So these observable actions that surround the tradition and ceremony of wedding is the normative process. The ideas behind it, the symbolisms that are attached to it, are your cognitive processes. Further, there are three elements of culture, and that those are values, norms, and beliefs. So we'll talk about values first. So values are the culture standards for discerning what is good and just in a society. Values are deeply embedded and critical for transmitting and teaching a culture's beliefs. So basically, values are deeply embedded in us and basically forms our ideation and worldview of the world around us. And it's basically also developed by culture through socialization. Since our younger years, from being part of the family, values are already being instilled. When you go to school, if you do go to school, values are being instilled. You know, when you travel around or when you move around your community or your society, you get to learn about the values as you go along the way. And then when you go to your work, go to a certain place or to another place, these values will be continuously taught and sanctioned in you. So each cultural group may have similar or different values. So there are certain values that are upheld in the Philippines that are also upheld in the United States, but there are also values that they aren't, similar, and we'll give certain examples for that. Now, sample Filipino values that we know, that are very much considered as this values are Filipino. Like, first one is family orientation. And remember, when you talk about values, this basically helps us interpret the world that we live in and motivates us to do whatever we need to do in a given cultural setting. So, family orientation means that a core of our beliefs and a core of our actions is always motivated by, is influenced by our family, and we do things in order to keep our family intact, no, to keep our family tight. Of course, family cohesion and family orientation is not as powerful as it has been in the many, many years ago. But compared to other countries, no, Philippines is very tight-knit in relation to family. A lot of our decisions come from our family. A lot of our motivations come to our family. A lot of our actions are in terms of working together towards the well-being of our family. Sometimes nga we have to put ourselves second, and the first is the family. And these decisions, these actions, this desire to be able to work for and work with the family, regardless of what your age, sets us apart compared to other Western countries wherein sila, when they reach the age of emancipation, 18 years old, 21 years old, whatever's the age of majority, they can already leave the responsibilities with their family of orientation, and they can create their own destinies. But in the Philippines, our destinies as human beings until we die is super tied with our family. Joy and humor and resilience are also considered as Filipino traits, and therefore that's also one of the reasons why mental health it's so hard to advocate in the Philippines, and the mental health awareness is low, because we have always been attuned to that idea that when you have a problem, you're a Filipino, so you can just laugh at it. You can just find joy in the negative things in your life. That you are a Filipino, you have to be resilient. So that's also the reason why it's so hard to call out the government sometimes for the things that you are experiencing, the sorrow and the bad things that you're experiencing in life, like the poverty. It's because we are always thought to be a Filipino is supposed to rise above all the things that they are experiencing, is whether it's positive or negative, because Filipinos are resilient. At a certain part, psychologically, that's good, because good mental resilience, good social resilience basically increases our survival in life. But too much adherence to resilience can also help not address problematic aspects of the social system. So just saying. So Filipinos daw are also known to be flexible and creative, no? Faith and religiosity is also very much part of the culture. So there are a lot of Catholic influences in terms of the way we do culture in the Philippines. And hospitality, is also considered as a value in the Philippines. Like whenever there's a guest, we always have to make that guest feel welcome. We always give all out for the guests that we have, especially if the guests are coming from another place or a foreign land. And of course, values doesn't necessarily mean that it's objectively correct, di ba? For example, my example on resilience, there's a objectively correct and objectively wrong aspect to resilience, no, that basically inhibits life outcomes, or allows life outcomes to be better. But in society, in a given society, these values are held so high that even if it's detrimental, it still has to be followed, and vice versa. Now, some common Western values that may be different, for example, in the Philippines, for example, is individualism. Because in the Philippines, we're very a collectivist nation. So our decisions, we have to conform with other people. We have to conform with our family and the community. Unlike, the free thought and individualism in other countries, wherein if you are at the age or that you are already legally able to decide, you can decide from your own, and the family can just take their hands off you in relation to decisions that you make and the destinies that you create in your lives. Democracy is also a Western value, right? It's a very American value that is also being pressed upon other countries. It's good. It's a good value, objectively good, but again, there are also lapses in every value in terms of the way they are implemented in a given culture. Equality is also a known Western value, because in the Philippines, our value is really our relationships are very vertical. Usually in a relationship, there's always someone who has higher power than the other. Like for example, in the doctor and patient relationship in the Philippines, we always are very submissive to our doctors. Patients would always just say yes to our doctors. But in other countries, the relationship, even if it's legally like one has more power than the other, usually very horizontal yung kanilang power dynamic. So usually the patient is known to have an equal standing with the doctor. No, the patient is empowered to speak to the doctor, to question the doctor's decisions and prescriptions, unlike in the Philippines. Rationalism is also Western values like the scientific thought, no? Scientific method is in itself Western, and harmony is also considered as a Western value, no? Although I think it's also something that's shared in the Philippines as well. Commonly all around the world, no, we value so many things that are common. Like for example, we all value life, we all value survival, right? We all value work, and therefore, people who act in such a way that are inviolable against these values, they're frowned upon in society, right? So, and there are many interpretations in terms of how the values should be upheld or should not be upheld. Now, how do we make sure that a certain value is kept in a society? How do we make sure that all people in a society or in a given cultural group all follow a given set of values? So, we do it by performing sanctions on people who follow or who don't follow ideals in relation to a certain value. So, for example, anywhere in the world probably we value hard work. So, that's a common value that we all uphold, right? Even in the Philippines, we value industry, we value hard work. So, how do we make sure that people always remember that this is a value? We can promote this by socializing and also react to certain things that may represent that value and may not represent the value. So, now, the reaction of society or reaction of the culture in relation to people or entities that follow the value are given positive sanctions. Ibig sabihin, these are what people who follow the values get in order to tell them that, yeah, it's a good job. You have to keep doing hard work. That's hard work. Okay? And then, if people are not following the value or not adhering to the values of the culture of the society, then they get negative sanctions. Just to always remind them that, hey, that's not according to the values of this nation or the values of this community. So we are calling you out, etc., etc. Now, there are two ways you can perform sanctions. One is you can perform them formally, meaning there is an articulation through a law or a policy that tells you that this is the formal way of sanctioning an act or a non-action. Okay? And there are also informal sanctions, like these are sanctions that we provide to people, but these sanctions are like your day-to-day living type of sanctions and not really something that's written in law or scripture or policy. So to give example, so again, we promote hard work in our society. So if you are a student and you perform well in your class, you study your notes, you study your lectures, you listen to your professor, you do your assignments, what would be the positive formal sanction for that? Of course, you will get a good grade. And that good grade is based on a policy of how grades should be computed in class, right? Or for example, you are a worker, you probably would get a promotion at work for showing hard work. So that's a formal sanction. So in this way, schools and workplaces make sure that the people remember that the value that we uphold in this society or in this community is hard work. And those people who do hard work will get positive sanctions formally through getting good grade or through getting promotion at work, or informally by probably saying, thank you, that's a good job, diba? Or probably saying, or probably getting positive testimonials, right? Ayan, si ganyan, magaling siya. This guy, he's a really good person. He's a very hardworking person. Yeah, so that's an example of an informal sanction that's positive. For example naman, okay, you are not performing well. You are not adhering to hard work as a value. No? And since this society, this community, this school is all about excellence, all about hard work, you will be negatively sanctioned for your lack of manifestation of hard work by getting a failed grade. Mali yung this paying a fine, getting jailed are also examples of formal negative sanctions but are not necessarily hard work. For example, we uphold life, the sanctity of life in our society, and you murdered someone, first degree murder, you really killed the person intentionally. Okay? You get jailed for it and you also pay a fine. So that everybody else in the society knows that if you do not respect the sanctity of life, you kill somebody because you intended to do it, because of hate or revenge, then you will be punished. Punishments is an example of a negative sanction. Another example of an informal negative sanction is, for example, receiving bad looks. No? For example, you are working in a group, and then each group member were asked to do something. And then sabi mo, I wasn't able to do my part because I slept longer than usual. And usually, you will receive bad looks from your friends to just tell you that we disapprove your act because you're not following what we are valuing, which is hard work and industry. Right? Or for example, recently, the DOH seemingly is lagging behind in terms of counting the cases. They're not pushing excellence and hard work, which we are upholding in the society. So how do we make sure that does not happen? We call them out on social media. We call them out in general, so that we tell these people who are not adhering to society's values of hard work and excellence that what you're doing is not good. It's not something that we approve in this culture. We're not approving that in this country. No? And of course, there's a lot of issues about that. No, to say that linear way, as I am saying it, of course, it sounds very ideal, but in the actual real world, there are a lot of competing interests as well. A lot of competing values that are found in every society, and therefore not all negative sanctions are applied equally to everyone. I will not discuss that yet for this specific topic. Like, for example, why wasn't Mocha jailed? So those issues, we'll talk about that later when we talk about deviant behavior. But in general, in an ideal society, when certain groups of people or entities are showing adherence to a value that is held highly in a society, they receive positive sanctions, whether that's a formal or an informal sanction. And then if a certain person, group of people, or entity is not adhering to a certain important value upheld so highly by society, they will receive negative sanctions through formal or non-formal means. We always remember that values also are not static. They change across time. Like, for example, many years ago, modesty was something that was a value prescribed among women in the Filipino society. But in our current society, modesty, covering someone's body, is not something that we uphold 100% as we used to do before. Now, we are now also advocating liberating the woman's body, allowing the woman to be able to take charge of her own body. So values aren't static. They change over time based on certain historical events that happen across that period of time, and of course the relationship that a certain culture has with other cultures. And number two, cultures change from one place to another. Like, for example, in the Philippines, we value heterosexual relationships, and therefore homosexual or same-sex relationship in the Philippines are considered as bad in our society, quote unquote, no? and therefore they're negatively sanctioned in society. It's either they don't, they don't get to be recognized in our society legally, and also they also receive some form of stigma and discrimination from different sectors of society because our culture place high value on heterosexual type of romance and sexual desire. No, but if you go to places like, for example, in the United States and other parts of Europe, they already accepted all forms of love, and therefore, people who express same-sex love in these other areas would not be as stigmatized or discriminated as they would if they were in the Philippines. Okay, now the second element of culture are beliefs. Now, beliefs are tenets or convictions that people hold to be true, and individuals in a society have specific beliefs, but they also have collective beliefs as well. And our beliefs spring from our values. No? For example, our value that we hold highly in the Philippines is freedom. And so therefore, a belief that we have because of that value is that everybody has an inherent right to different types of freedom as long as they don't step on other people's freedom or do not pose a threat to society. So, beliefs spring from values. Okay? Now, beliefs also form what we call an ideal culture and a real culture. So, beliefs are more of an ideal culture. So what's an ideal culture? Ideal culture is basically what we believe as what our culture should be. Now, for example, I believe that the Philippines is a country that has freedoms, that we are a very family-oriented people. These are ideal of a Filipino. So that's the ideal Filipino. But when you go to the ground, when you go to the Philippines, we do know that a lot of the beliefs and values that we have as a society doesn't really flow. No? Like, for example, in the Philippines, we value freedom. However, there are many practices in the government and even in families and communities that are very repressive of freedom. So, the actual implementation of the culture, as we know it, which is outside the ideal, is the real culture. So, for example, our constitution basically is a set of our beliefs of what the ideal culture of the Philippine society should be. But we, based of course on the things that are happening currently, we know that the constitution, while it should be enshrined in our society, is not follow en toto. And therefore, the actual culture that we are experiencing, whether or not it follows or does not follow the ideal culture, is your real culture. And the third element of culture are norms. And norms define how people should behave in accordance to what society values, what we define as good, right, and important. And most members of the society adheres to them or has to adhere to them. So if values and beliefs are the what and the why of our culture, norms is the how of our culture, so how we behave. So values and beliefs are the cognitive process of our culture, of our non-material culture, and norms are the normative process of our non-material culture. And there are four types of it, no? We have folkways, and basically folkways are just norms that stem from casual interactions that does not really form some sort of morality around it. For example, in the Philippines, an example of a folkway is when we greet our elders, no, we place their hands in our forehead, mano po. That's an example of a folkway. If you don't do it, you are not a bad person, no? Or for example, in Japan, there's a specific way that you have to receive a business card, no, where you have to hold the business card with your two hands, and you also have to accept it with your two hands. It's called meishi, no, meishi. So that's also an example of a folkway in Japan. Of course, in Bangkok, if you've been there, they have the greeting, sawadee-ka. So that's also an example of a folkway. Again, if this isn't done, will you receive negative sanctions if you don't do folkways? Probably. You will be judged. You will get bad stares, but you will not be jailed, or you will not be considered as immoral in the given society if you break a folkway. Mores, on the other hand, is a norm that basically adheres to what is right or what is wrong. So these norms are connected to the moral base of a culture. So for example, stealing, thou shall not steal. So stealing is an act that can consider you as an immoral, and therefore that norm of inhibiting yourself from stealing something that's not yours is a more. So just think of it as a more is a norm that if you do not abide by it, you will be considered immoral in a society. So, for example, talking back to your parents is considered as a more because, again, we value highly and we respect parents, right? Killing someone may be considered as a more because we value life, and you will be considered immoral if you kill someone intentionally. Or, for example, we value excellence in this society, and therefore, if you perform bad at your job, like for example, you are a doctor and you fail to perform well on the patient, and the patient died or become debilitated because of that, that is also called a more. The non-adherence to professional guidelines is also called a more, because you can be rendered as immoral if you don't follow this. Right? Or for example, if you bring pornographic materials to De La Salle University, because we believe that body should be sanctified, body is dignified, so therefore it should not be treated that way. So you could be considered immoral for bringing pornographic materials to the LSU. So that's a more. Now, when mores are coded or articulated into policies and laws, they become a law. So mores are can either be formal or non-formal, but when mores become formal, they can be laws, especially when they are inscribed at the state level, right? So penal code, that's a law, right? Cyber libel, that's a law. Data privacy breach, that's an example of a law. And a law is a norm also found in our society. And finally, we have taboos. So taboo is a strong and negative norm that violates and results in extreme disgust, and this is shared by almost all cultures. So an example of a taboo, as it has been explained, is cannibalism, incest. So these are examples of taboo na most cultures, if not all cultures, consider as bad and very repulsive. Now, another important component of the cognitive process of the non-material culture are symbols. So what are symbols? Symbol is an object, word, or action that stands for an idea or a meaning that is culturally defined. Any physical manifestation that signifies that ideology or particular culture. And symbols are found in both material cultures, like for example, the things that I showed you earlier. For example, the hijab, it is symbolic of something. So that's an example of a material culture that is also a symbol. And non-material culture, for example, norms like pagmamano, these are called symbols, right? These are acts, these are objects, these are images that hold a very specific cultural idea that is constructed by a given cultural group. And of course, for example, we have these cultural symbols that are found in professional groups. Like for example, just by the uniform that they are wearing, you already know what professional group they belong to, because the uniform that they wear carries some sort of symbol. I can speak for nursing because I'm a nurse. For example, the white that we wear as nurses symbolizes cleanliness and hygiene and purity in terms of care. And of course, the cross that we wear in our caps, especially if you're a female nurse, no, male nurses don't wear caps. No, it of course symbolizes health. So we just don't wear this uniform without reason, but they have a cultural symbolic meaning as well. No, for example, priests and nuns, they wear crosses, because it symbolizes that they value Christianity or Catholicism. For nuns, diba, they wear veil, no? They wear their habit to show their obedience and submissiveness to religion as well. So, yon. And of course, you also have this set of examples. These are logos that represent an organization. Sometimes you don't really have to read like the name of an organization. Just see the brand logo and you know that that one is, for example, this one, you don't have to write it, but I know this is something to do with the OST. So I don't have to write the OST on the name, but I know by the symbol that this is the OST. For example, this one, I know that this is LRT. So this figure, despite the words, despite no words, already holds meaning and identity. This one, DNR, if I'm not mistaken. So DNR yan. Okay, so these are examples also of other symbols in society. Now, actions and gestures also hold an inherent meaning and also are symbolic. Yung tinatawag natin in communication as non-verbal cues. For example, saying okay like this, you like the chef's kiss, okay. So in most countries we say that this one, are you okay, and then you do this sign, then you don't have to say anything and they say okay. But in other countries, like for example in Middle Eastern countries, this one is the evil eye, so it presents allegiance to the bad ominous things, or for example nodding and shaking head. Like for example, we know that if we nod we say yes, if we shake our head we say no. But in other countries like Greece and Bulgaria, if you nod your head it's no, when you shake your head it's yes. So again, symbols are different when you go from one culture to another, just like values are different if you go from one culture to another. For example, this one, we know that this one is rock on, or you're enjoying the music that you are hearing. But in certain areas, it means that your wife is sleeping with another person. Very specific, but yeah, it's another symbol. So the basic gestures that we do, the placement of the placement of our feet, the placement of our hands, the way we raise our eyebrows, the way we do our hair, all have inherent meanings that are culturally ascribed. And these are all considered as well as symbols. Also, these are examples of symbols. Like for example, the hashtag Black Lives Matter, while it's just a short phrase, it represents a whole system of advocacy against racial oppression in the States and elsewhere. And of course, like the act of burning political effigies, like for example, this was way back in the early 2000s. This is a protest against Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and this act of burning an effigy of her image is already a symbol of disdain and dissent against her governance during that time. However, in all societies, the most intricate form of symbolic systems that we have in order for us to communicate are called languages. So a language is a symbolic system through which people communicate, through which culture is transmitted, speaking and writing. And of course, in the video of Nicole, we already discussed about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that basically says that our society, our culture is shaped by the language that we use, And I'd like to give an example of that in relation to the Filipino language. So for example, there's no Tagalog equivalent of ambivalent na word, right? So probably it's because that term does not exist, or that feeling of ambivalence does not exist in the Filipino culture. That's why a space in our language was not allowed for it. For example, bayanihan has no specific English transliteration. It's because bayanihan is a very culturally a specific idea in the Philippines that may not be seen in most other countries elsewhere. Po and opo as interjections are also not seen in other languages. But we put interjections like this as, because we pay respect to our elders and to those who have higher positions than us. And that is also a part of our culture. We respect the elderly, we respect those of higher position, and we allow that in our language to flourish because that is what represented our our culture, no? And then of course, we have the he and she language, he and she pronouns in the English language, but in the Philippines, our pronouns are all gender neutral. Siya, ikaw, ako, tayo, sila. So, and it means that when Tagalog was being seen as a valuable mode of communication in the Philippines, we didn't feel like there was a demarcation about, men and women in society. There was no discrimination probably prior to, us being colonized. I'm not saying no discrimination, but it is not as apparent as Western countries have had during that time. And even now, when we look at our scores for gender equality measures, Philippines is doing a lot much better compared to even some of the, more developed countries. So these are some examples of how Sapir-Whorf hypothesis could be interpreted in the Philippine language. Of course, I'm no linguist, and linguists probably would have, better examples for this. But so far, this is like the basic examples that I know. Okay, here are some other concepts that we need to also discuss that was not discussed in the crash course video. We have ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is the belief that one's culture is superior than the other. So I don't know if you've traveled before, but there's always that feeling that, for example, when I went to Singapore, my first thought was, I know the Philippines may not be as good as Singapore, but we probably are more emotional and more expressive and less impersonal. So I think we're better off as a society than Singapore. So there's always that feeling everyone is ethnocentric. There's always that feeling that there's that component to our culture that's always much better than other cultures. And that's a normal thing to feel because we were born in the culture that we were born in, and that's the only exposure that we have for a long period of time, and therefore we can always feel some sort of discomfort when we are placed in another culture wherein we don't see the common things that we see within our culture. So that is ethnocentrism, the belief that our culture is superior than the others. Is it normal? Yes. Can it be controlled? Yes. Next, we have culture shock. Culture shock is the physical discomfort that we feel when we are placed in a foreign or a new cultural environment that is totally unrecognizable for us. And it renders us immobile, it renders us almost paralyzed, as if. Like, for example, some OFWs would feel so homesick because the architecture or the design of their houses does not look like a Filipino household, and therefore they feel so agitated to be inside that space. Like, for example, when they come inside the CR, they cannot find a tabo, a dipper, which is again a big part of our hygiene stuff when we are here in the Philippines. So that's culture shock. When our ethnocentric becomes so debilitating because we are exposed to a new culture, that's culture shock. Cultural imperialism is one form of extreme ethnocentrism where we impose our culture on another cultural group. An example of cultural imperialism happened during the imperialism period in the medieval times. An example is when the Spaniards came here in the Philippines. They, of course, colonized us, and they pushed upon us the religious culture of Catholicism and erased all of the other devotions that we had for our earlier religions outside Catholicism. So that's an example of cultural imperialism. Do we still have cultural imperialism now? Yes, we still have a lot of cultural imperialism. Like, for example, democracy is being pushed, in other countries that do not have democracy as their guiding principle. If it's good or bad, we're not sure. But that's an example of cultural imperialism, because democracy is a Western idea, and we pushing that in Middle Eastern countries and other countries is a form of cultural imperialism as well. Or, for example, the involuntary Chineseification of the Philippines could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be pointed as cultural imperialism as well. Another term is called xenocentrism. Xenocentrism is when you are exposed to a more advanced culture or society and you feel disappointed or out of place when you come back to your own culture. Like, for example, some overseas Filipino workers would experience this. Like, they went to the States or they went to a European country and they see how advanced that society is, so that when they come back in their country, they will suddenly feel out of place and so disappointed, and probably their own cultural identity of the being Filipino becomes a cause of shame for them. So that's an example of xenocentrism. It's the opposite of ethnocentrism. So we feel like our culture is inferior to other cultures. So that's xenocentrism. Next term is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the practice of appraising one's culture based on its own standards. So this one is first appraising or being aware that you have ethnocentric tendencies. And after that, when you are placed in a culture, in another culture, you withhold your ethnocentric beliefs and appraise and evaluate the new culture you belong in based on its own standards. So, for example, if, in Singapore, I would run to a bus stop, and because I am late for 3 seconds and the bus left me, in the Philippines, I would have felt so bad because, there would be the Philippines would have done it this way. They could have waited for me before it left. But Singapore is all about efficiency. It's all about being on time. Time management is something that they value highly in Singapore. So in Singapore standards, I would not feel bad for being left by the bus, because that's how they do it in Singapore. So I shouldn't feel bad for being left, right? So, meaning cultural relativism is judging one's culture based on its standards. While cultural relativism is generally a good practice in order to understand another person's culture, in order to make policies for places that are different from yours, to be able to go around the world without having unnecessary problems because you are understanding the culture of other people, you are understanding their own standards. However, there are certain activities done by a given culture that we cannot just say, no, let's just let them do it because that's their culture. We cannot just let cultures do what they want, especially if the cultural practice is inherently evil or immoral. Like, for example, certain indigenous tribes in Africa perform female genital mutilation. In short, female circumcision. Trigger warning, they cut the genitalia, the clitoris of the woman because they believe that it could be a seat of evil. So, and biologically speaking, biomedically speaking, that is a very harmful act. Aside from the person who receives female genital mutilation is at risk for infection and hemorrhage. Number two, it's an unnecessary operation compared to a male circumcision, which has really scientific benefits, like one, cleanliness, and two, decreased risk of getting STIs like HIV. So female genital mutilation is not a beneficial surgery at all. It's just a cultural act, and it gives a lot of pain and harm and trauma to the person who is receiving it. So should we just say no? But that's how they do it. Let's just allow them to do it. No. So cultural relativism has its limits as well. Or for example, child marriage. Child marriage is they do it, and one country that I know who does it is Yemen. Like for example, 40-year-old men marrying 8-year-old children. So as we respect that children are not yet fully mentally formed to make legal decisions for themselves, including marriage. And there are already documentations of young females who die because of hemorrhage due to forced sex. And again, the reproductive system of the young girls, it's not fully formed to be able to accommodate sexual intercourse, and therefore it could be detrimental to their health and safety. So again, like we said, cultural relativism has a limit. But generally, cultural relativism should be considered if you are a sociologist, to be able to see a culture based on its own standards, and to also get to look out for this specific abhorrent activities as well. Next, we also have what we call cultural universals. Cultural universals are ideas and entities that are common to all cultures. Like, of course, there are a lot of inherent differences from one culture to another in terms of values and materials. However, there are ideas and entities that are common to all cultures. Like, all cultures value life and survival. All cultures have family structures of their own. All cultures have a language structures of their own. They have their own food preparation techniques. These are called cultural universals, which are usually neutral ideas like life, family, food, language. Next, we have also categorizations of culture. We have high versus pop culture. So as explained by Nicole, high culture is the cultural experience and materials that is accessed by and appreciated mostly by those who are found in the higher class of society, and usually connected to those of high intellectualism. So what are high cultural activities? Ballets, orchestra, those kinds of things. And pop culture are usually also what we call mass culture, or this is the set of cultural experiences that is accessible to most of those who are found in the middle to the lower class of the population. So for example, we talk about high culture as Pavarotti, right, or Sarah Brightman. Pop culture would be Taylor Swift or Sarah Geronimo. Yan. And also, we have subcultures. Subcultures are basically smaller cultural groups found in a larger culture. An example would be regional groups and indigenous groups in the Philippines. For example, in the picture, we have someone who's from Ifugao. We also have Aitas, and we also have Hiligaynons in the Visayas, and we also have your Tausugs from the southern part of the Philippines. Now, what is important about subcultures is that they're called subcultures because they still identify to the larger broad-based culture. So for example, a person who identifies as Tausug also identifies to be a Filipino. A person who identifies himself as a Bisaya also identifies as a Filipino. And the regional category or the indigenous category is part of the larger category of Filipino. Now, there are also subcultures we call countercultures. These are cultures found within a larger culture whose practices go against the majority or the dominant culture. Kaya nga, counter. So, example na binigay ni Nicole would be the emos of the 90s, 90s and 2000s. The hippies of the 70s. So these are countercultures. Now, cultural diffusion talks about the extent to which an innovation, when introduced to a society, will be able to change the ways or change the culture. Now, when we talk about innovations, there are two types of innovations. Innovation is something new in a culture. Now, there are two types. We have discovery. Discovery is knowing something that has always been there, but we just discovered it. For example of a discovery is the picture of the black hole that we just saw recently in the last year. And then also another discovery is the ability of a certain gene in the body to be able to stop aging. So this gene, the black hole, has always been there, and then we discovered its existence. An invention, on the other hand, is something that we create. An example of an invention: cell phones, smartphones, gadgets. These are examples of inventions. So when you talk about cultural change, it is the extent to which innovation is able to penetrate a culture, and a culture adapting to the innovation that matters, right? Or that's the factor that basically propels cultural change. For example, as an early millennial, I was able to see how our society has changed prior to the internet to now that we have internet. So prior to the internet, we didn't have, online banking services. So if you had to go and withdraw or deposit money, you have to go physically to the bank. But right now, because we have already adopted a lot of the digital innovations in many areas of our lives, the way we do enrollment is digital. The way we withdraw money is also digital. The way we pay is also digital. I mean, I can just imagine how we are able to perform classes if we did this 20 years ago when there's no internet. It's not as accessible as it was before. So cultural diffusion basically talks about to what extent do we see a certain innovation getting into a culture and changing the way things are done in a certain country, and the time that lapses when from the time that innovation is introduced to the time that it is absorbed by society is called cultural gap. Again, cultural gap is the time in between a certain innovation is introduced in a society and the time where it fully adapts that innovation into society. So that's cultural gap. So the gap is the introduction to the normalization of tech. Now, cultural lag is when we see a longer time from the introduction to the normalization of technology. And usually we see that in more underdeveloped and politically autocratic countries. Like for example, everywhere we have innovated, everywhere there's Facebook, there's social media, but we can see that in politically autocratic countries, like for example, North Korea, the absorption of that type of innovation of social media has not yet fully penetrated, and therefore we expect a greater cultural lag compared to other countries. So, how can the three major sociological paradigms explain culture and its functions in society? So, structural functionalists would say culture is important in society because it helps in, putting cohesion, integration, and harmony in society, because we have values, ideals, beliefs, laws, norms, and taboos. Everybody can know how to perform well in society. So, that is the function of society according to structural functionalism. According to conflict theory, culture is an entity in a society that perpetuates oppression. Like for example, high culture, pop culture. Some cultural experiences are inaccessible to those from lower classes. Right? And then of course we talk about countercultures, wherein the subculture is fighting against or pushing back against a dominant culture. So culture, according to conflict theory, only just perpetuates the oppression that is already there. Like for example, certain cultures feel like women should be second-class citizens in their culture. And according to conflict theory, culture, in that specific example, is a perpetuator of oppression in relation to sex and gender. Finally, symbolic interactionism says that culture is basically an entity in society that holds a lot of symbols. Culture is basically an entity that has a chock full of meanings, and these meanings change over time. These meanings that we have in a certain culture is influenced by the interactions that people and entities in that community or society has. So that is symbolic interactionism on culture. Next, let's talk about the different forms of society. So just to explain, don't confuse culture with society. We can use them interchangeably, but we always have to know the difference. Society refers to the people interacting within a specific geographic bound. No? Culture is basically the values, beliefs, and norms they have in order to live in that society. So the what and the who is the society. The how and the why is the culture. Now, there are different types of societies based on their level of socio-cultural evolution based on Gerard Lenski. Again, if we go back to cultural diffusion, this talks about the extent of technology and innovation that is found in a society that basically tells us what type of society it is. So the early form of society is called hunter and gatherer society. Basically, what they do is they hunt and they gather in order for them to survive. That's what they do in a society day in and day out. Now, they don't have any other activities except for survival. Basically, they are nomadic, meaning they don't have a permanent settlement because they have to go from one place to another based on the amount of resources, animals, and plants that are available to them. And according to Emil Durkheim, these societies manifest mechanical solidarity wherein everybody in the community or in the society does the same thing. They hunt, they gather, they create fire. They all know and do the same thing. There's no differentiation in terms of the activities that they're doing because there is only one thing that they could do in order to survive based on the limited resources that they have in order for them to survive. And therefore, that's mechanical solidarity. Next, we have pastoral society. So, pastoral societies, basically, marunong na sila, they already know how to domesticate animals, but they are still nomadic. So, because animals, they also need resources like water and plants. So, they have to move from one place to another where the resources for the animals could be found. So, wala pa silang permanent settlement. However, for horticultural societies whose main source of survival are plants, and they're able to already know how to plant, these plants, they already have permanent settlements because they don't have to move from one place to another because they already plant, and the plants are the sources for their subsistence. And usually, these horticultural societies, they already live near a body of water. So in terms of water needs, they already are covered. So permanent settlements na sila. And then, next, what happened is that the societies innovated in terms of the way they did planting and domestication of animals. They now become aware about how to do crop rotation. Okay? So, because they were able to do it, they're now able to settle more permanently. And they were able to create their own civilizations. And this is the birth of agricultural societies. At the same time, agricultural societies also already had social hierarchy, meaning there's already someone who owns the land and there are already people who can work for the land, and therefore the feudal lord, soldier, and farmer peasant relationship already built there. So there's already the start of power dynamics and differentiation of work. And then after agricultural societies, it started in the 1700s, the birth of industrial societies, in the birth of the steam engine, wherein the production of materials became faster, there were more surplus, and of course there's there's a lot of production and manufacturing, so that is most of what the lives were going for, no? There's a lot of people in factories producing stuff, no? And it also became where capitalism started, right? Wherein there are now people who own the means of production, and of course we have laborers who work in them, right? And also during this time, industrial societies, there's also the introduction of different professions and differentiated activities, the rise of formal education, the rise of medicine as well. So now people don't do the same thing. They aren't all farmers, right? There are certain groups of people who prepare the food, certain groups of people who educate, certain group of people who rear the young, certain groups of people who do medicine, and together they work in order to make a functioning society during the industrial period. And therefore, we now have what we call organic solidarity. There is now differentiation and interdependence in the actions found in the members of the society. And it was compelled by the industrialized societies. And finally, no, developed countries nowadays are found in the post-industrialized society, no? And post-industrial society are those societies that rely most on information and knowledge economy in order to flourish. No, so example of post-industrial societies are those found in Silicon Valley. Yeah, so those are example of post-industrialized societies. Now, where is the Philippines? Now, in the Philippines, we're mostly an industrializing society, but majorly we are still an agricultural society. So it could be that in a state, no, in a country, there would be different forms of societies found in it. Like for example, yes, we have industrialized centers. Like for example, NCR in itself, it can be considered as an industrialized urban center. And we also have agricultural peripherals around NCR and in other regional parts of the country, in the provinces. So we also have agricultural societies. And we also still have hunter and gatherer societies in the Philippines. Some indigenous peoples who still are not penetrated by innovation are still getting and hunting, their food. No? So there's still hunter-gatherer societies in the Philippines. So there. Okay, so in this video, we were able to learn about the different elements and components of culture, the different concepts related to culture, and then we were able to learn about the different forms of society and the inherent characteristics of each.